Randy co-founded BioFire, BFDX is at the title, with two of his partners, one of whom is here today, in 1990. How many of you were born after 1990?
Oh, that's painful.
Okay, so just to make you feel as old as I do every time I come to class with these great guys. So 30 years ago, he founded the company and sold it about 6 years ago and is still actively involved in the company. He started working with the company as a senior scientist, then a medical director, became the chief operating officer in 2000 and the president in 2008. He's an inventor of more than 20 BioFire's patents and the author of numerous grants and publications related to the company's technologies. Important for many of you who might be looking for a job upon graduation, he employs 100 or so UVU graduates and is looking for more, so perhaps you should see him after. He has a PhD in biology from the University of Utah, a BS in microchemistry from Utah State University. So with that and UVU employees, he's kind of one of us. He's almost a Wolverine. We're grateful to have him here. He's married and has one son who's attending Brown University. Would you please give it up for Dr. Randy Rasmussen?
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. So you're mostly business students, do I have that right? Okay. So what I had in mind talking about today is I'm thinking of you as the future managers of high-tech companies. So that may not be where everybody has in mind, but as a biotech that's grown a lot over the years, we are constantly in search of good management. Good management for a high-tech is a really particular skill. And and the main thrust of what I'm going to talk about is how you think about managing high-tech, how you think about managing innovation, and how that's different than sort of day-to-day business management. But first, I'll give you a little bit of background on our company and what we do. Partially, this is to just give me some credibility so you guys feel like I know what I'm talking about. So, as Tom mentioned, we started in the 90s. There's my partner, Carl, who's just here in the front row. And we are holding proudly the first prototype of the light cycler, which was our first big hit. And you can see that that's a vacuum cleaner right there, and I'm holding a hair dryer. And that provided the hot and cold air for thermocycling a PCR reaction. When I show this picture to our engineers, they are totally grossed out that we would ever do anything that crude and ridiculous. But it worked, and it got us going and really produced the first hit in the company. So that's sort of where we were at in the 90s. We were working out of a little garage in Idaho Falls. And fast forward to now, that's my current executive team. And this is our new facility in Research Park, where we have about 2,500 employees. We should be 3,000 by the end of the year. The last I checked, we had 200 job openings. So seniors, please check us out. Check out our website and give us some thought. So we've developed a lot of platforms over the years, but all of them have been molecular diagnostic platforms. So I'm a molecular biologist. We got interested very early in PCR. So PCR is the polymerase chain reaction. It's a way to take a small amount of DNA and amplify it up into a large amount of DNA. And there are a lot of different uses for that. But one is for diagnostics, to look for the presence of viruses or bacteria that cause disease and that are present in too small a quantity to be able to detect them directly. But if you do this amplification, you can then see them. And so we have been playing around with ways to do this faster and better for many years now, and have developed one platform after another. And that has led to, I think, pretty impressive economic growth, especially in the film array era. So I would brag that we were doubling every year for about the last 10 years. My CFO told me that that was overstatement, and she calculated it, and it's actually only 80% a year, not 100%. So, but we've been pretty busy trying to scale up. And I feel so lucky to have been able to see our company go from 3 people in a garage to 3,000 people, and to scale up all of the parts of a company that it takes to maintain that. It's really been a great experience and has allowed me to learn every part of business in a way that I think is pretty unique and gives you a really interesting perspective on it. So this is our current hit. It's called the film array, and that's this instrument here. And what we were able to do with the film array for the first time was to take a sample from a patient. And in the old days of diagnostics, say 10 years ago, if your physician thought you might have an infectious disease, what the physician would do is look at your symptoms and then make sort of a mental list of the organisms that could be causing that. And then she would order tests one at a time down that list until she hit on an organism that was positive. Okay? And this process would take about a day or two for each round. And what we realized is that if you could simultaneously detect for all of the things that normally cause these diseases, you could really help the physician do better diagnostics. You could get the patient on the right drug faster. And this would make the physician's life easier, would make the patient's treatment better, and could really change the way people thought about diagnostics. And this system allowed us to do that. And I won't go through the gory details with you, but the patient sample gets sucked into this disposable here, and then it kind of cycles through various stages of processing that used to have to be done in a highly technical laboratory. So only very top-end hospitals and top-end laboratories could do this kind of testing. And now with this system, I could teach any of you to do this testing in about 2 minutes. And it has opened up this sort of sophisticated testing to every hospital, even really small hospitals. One of my favorite hospitals is one up in Idaho that runs all of our panels, and they're a 12-bed hospital. And they're now able to do diagnostics at a level of sophistication that only a Duke or a Mass General would have been able to do just a few years ago. And that really makes a big difference to the patients there. Okay. So this test that I'm showing here is for meningitis, and we have 5 different panels now that test for different syndromes. So what all of these panels have in common is that the patient has one set of symptoms that can be caused by a wide variety of organisms. And depending on what organism is causing the disease, the treatments vary, and the severity of the infection varies. So the first panel we did is respiratory infections, and you can hear my last respiratory infection in my voice now. It's the most common infection on Earth. Okay. It is usually not serious, like mine was not serious, but at millions of infections per year, it kills a lot of people, especially babies and old folks. And we're right in the middle of kind of a nasty flu season right now. And it'll kill, this season will probably kill 100 babies in the United States with respiratory infections. And many of these children could be saved with these sort of rapid diagnostics. Our next panel was for blood infections. These are relatively rare, but also extremely serious. You can die in just a few days if you're not on the right antibiotic. Then we have a gastrointestinal panel. This is probably the second most common type of infection. It's not super life-threatening for the most part, but it's unpleasant and everybody wants to get rid of it. Then the meningitis panel, these are brain and blood infections, or brain and spinal cord infections. This is really interesting because 90% of the time they're not serious at all. But about 10% of the time when they're bacterial infections, it can kill you in very short order. So everybody with symptoms of meningitis is watched extremely carefully. But with these quick tests, we can now identify the people who are not at risk of dying from the people who are. And then those 10% that are at risk of dying can be cared for more carefully. Everybody else can be sent home. So it's a real cost saving to the hospital and a relief to the patients to find out they're not at risk of imminent death as well. And then our final panel is for pneumonia. So mostly bacterial infections in your lungs. This is a top 10 cause of death. And in all these cases, we're trying to sort through many pathogens to figure out what's going on and what the physician can do about it. And this is our marketing campaign, which we're super proud of. And this is my favorite of our taglines: don't guess, know. If there's a list of 20 or 30 pathogens that could be causing your patient's disease, you can guess and test for that, or you can just test for everything at the same time and then treat them properly. And that has really been what has sold this system to physicians all over the United States, is they can finally very quickly figure out what's causing their patient's disease. And when they figure that out, they make a lot better choices. They stop running as many tests, they stop treating with inappropriate drugs. Lots of good things happen to those patients. So these are all the organisms that we test for in the respiratory panel. So a big problem in medicine right now is overuse of antibiotics, and it's causing the rise of resistant bacteria. And the most common infection on Earth, is a big driver of that. So about 5% of respiratory infections are caused by bacteria, and that's these bacteria right here. And they are appropriately treated with antibiotics. But physicians can't tell whether you have the bacterial form or the viral form. And so often physicians will give you an antibiotic just in case you've got one of these. But in fact, you usually don't. What you usually have is one of these viruses. And there's some you've heard of, like the flu, okay? But all of these other viruses, here's some coronaviruses. You might have heard of a relative of these that's shutting down the economy in China right now. The parainfluenza viruses, and all sorts of different viruses that are always flying around all the time. So we talk about flu season, but in fact, it's not flu season, it's respiratory viral season. And these are all of the different causes of respiratory infections that are flying around. So we have about 1,000 of our machines hooked into a database, and they're constantly feeding us what people are infected with. And this is the current flu season right here. And you can see that it's not just flu. There's all these different viruses floating around. And down here, a low level of bacteria. And there's no way a physician could tell which of these things is causing their patient's disease, right? But we can now sort through that, and the test is super easy to run, and it takes about an hour to get the result. And so hospitals are putting these in their emergency rooms and their hospital labs, and really allowing their physicians to quickly make intelligent decisions about treatment. Okay. This is a classic sort of example of what happens with patients that come into a hospital. So this woman came into the emergency department with difficulty breathing. And she was diagnosed with sarcoidosis, which is an autoimmune disorder of your lungs. And this happens also with GI infections as well, where autoimmune diseases and infections look a lot alike in terms of their symptoms. If you've got an autoimmune disease, what you need to do is turn down the immune system. So they'll give steroids or other drugs that make your immune system less active. But if you've got an infection, that's exactly the wrong thing to do, right? So these are the sort of dilemmas that physicians are faced with. Is this an autoimmune, and I should turn down the immune system, or is this an infection, and I need to turn up the immune system or give an antibiotic? And this patient came in and was put on an immune suppressant, but an RP panel showed that she was positive for adenovirus. And so the hospital was quickly able to correct this error, take her off the steroids, put her on an antiviral, okay? So Tom mentioned that, that's our shtick, that's our thing, that's what we do. We call it syndromic testing, and that's in reference to these different sort of constellations of symptoms like respiratory infection or GI infection. Test for everything at once, give the physician the information and let them act on it. So about 6 years ago, we were purchased by a traditional microbiology company called bioMérieux. Headquarters are in Lyon, France. And they were worried that traditional microbiology was going to lose out to molecular biology. They were correct about that. And so they wanted to buy a molecular biology company. And we thought it was a good fit. So they currently invest about 14% of their revenue in R&D. That is hundreds of millions of dollars of R&D a year. Okay? From all of that investment, there have been no major revenue-generating products come out of bioMérieux's R&D system in about 8 years. Okay? This is pretty shocking, right? That's a shocking amount of money to spend without producing a revenue-generating product. And in contrast, we've added about 6 major revenue-generating products in the last 6 or 7 years. And I believe the difference between those two results on the R&D side is not that our scientists are smarter, because I've met many of these French scientists, I've worked with them, they're brilliant, okay? It's a cultural difference in the way the company manages their R&D. And I want to talk to you guys as future managers about the things that I think matter in making an R&D group productive. So this is my list of the things that matter if you want an innovative company. You have to be very flexible in your approach. You have to have candid communication within the company. People at very low levels of the company have to be comfortable coming to upper management and saying that you're doing something wrong. And upper management has to be ready to listen to that. While you have to be very flexible on your approach, you need a strong sense of your priorities. Where are you trying to get to? What is the product that you want to develop in the end? And in that process, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. You have to have a tolerance for mistakes. And I think a nice thing about high-tech companies is they have a high tolerance for what I would call smart mistakes. Okay? So if you have a really good idea about how something might work and it doesn't pan out, we're totally cool with that, right? But another characteristic of high-tech companies is they tend to be very intolerant of technical incompetence. So if you make a dumb mistake, you're going to pay for that in a high-tech company in a way you won't in a regular company. We're not very tolerant of that kind of mistake. And then finally, we have a commitment to obsolete our own products. At the session where we were purchased, my partner Kirk stood up and said it was his goal to kill the film array system. This was a system they just spent $500 million acquiring. Very nervous laughter went through the room. They did not think this was funny. And you can see why, having just spent all that money. But in fact, a commitment to make sure that your product, that the successor to your product is a really important part of a high-tech company. You know, in contrast, in these bigger companies, there's a lot of focus on timeline adherence and budget discipline. And as companies get bigger, you can understand that problem. You can understand why they want to focus on this. But I have to say that in my opinion, budgets are evil. And I hope to see business evolve in a way that is less obsessed with budgets. Budgets give managers the illusion of control as they try to project the future and try to stick to that projection. But it is only an illusion. You cannot project the future accurately. And if you try to hold the company to these predictions as the year goes on, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. So budget discipline may be fine in a mature company, but in a growing company, you've got to be more flexible than that. Like a lot of mature companies, there's a no bad news policy. Okay? It's very hierarchical, and nobody tells the boss that they're doing the wrong thing. You cannot have that in an innovative company. Someone's got to be there to tell you the bad news. And then there's a focus on employment stability and a fear of cannibalism of your new products. So there's a sort of high-risk, low-risk split in the way these companies are operated. And there are a lot of, I don't want to come across like these things are bad on the right side, but they are part of a lower risk, slower growth environment. And if you're trying to manage for innovation, that's not what you want. Okay. So here's an example. This was actually this is a panel that's still upcoming. This is for infections in bones and joints. Okay. So periodically, a patient will come into the emergency room with a knee or an elbow that's swollen and infected. And what the ER needs to figure out is what bacteria is causing that infection and get the right antibiotic on board. Okay, this is going to be a cool panel. And we did this through the French affiliate. Okay. It took 3 times the normal amount of time for a panel to be developed, and the schedule was blown by about a factor of 2. Okay. And it was really weird. Because this happened because, in my view, of an obsession with budgets and timelines. So as you planned out your development path, you would say, okay, this year I need 3 people, and I need them to work on this project. Well, it turns out that part of the project was more complicated than you thought. So what you really needed was like 5 people. But oh no, 5 people aren't in the budget, it's only 3 people. So you have to wait till next year to add those 2 people, right? So in defending the annual budget, they actually blew up the budget of the project. So you've got to make sure that you are willing to respond to the problems that come in every development path. Okay? So candid communication up and down the organization. This is, I think, maybe the most important thing on this list. So famously, when Dwight Eisenhower presented the D-Day plan to his generals, he said to them, "It is your patriotic obligation to tell me if you see anything wrong with this plan, if you see a way that this plan can be done better." He was demanding from his generals not that they salute and tell him that he would carry it out, but rather that they tell him if there is any problem with it. This is super important. Okay? The bigger the company gets, the more important you get in the company, the less likely people are to want to tell you the truth. And you have to demand from them that they tell you the truth, okay? That you know how projects are going. So this is the Vitek card, which is one of bioMérieux's projects, most important products. And it's a really cool device that sucks up a little bit of bacterial sample, and it tests to see which antibiotics are successful in killing that bacteria. It's really cool. It costs like $5. It does a really good job. And under the current iteration, it can test 64 different combinations of antibiotics and controls. But there's a lot of bugs and a lot of antibiotics in the world, and so they wanted to increase this to 102 different conditions. Okay? And this is the sort of incremental improvement project that ought to go in a very straightforward way. And it was worked on, and then it was launched. And immediately after launch, it was withdrawn from the market. So I went down to St. Louis to talk to some of the engineers there. And I grabbed this engineer in the hall and I said, "What went wrong with the Opus card?" And he said, "The Opus, what went wrong? It never worked." So you can actually see in this picture some bubbles, right? And as in these big wells, those bubbles were tolerable. The optics could see around them. But as they added more wells, the wells shrunk and the bubbles stayed the same size. So their signal to noise went to hell. Everyone knew it. Everyone was afraid to say anything about it. Okay. So this project ended up costing millions, being launched, and then being withdrawn from the market. This is what happens when your engineers do not feel like they can tell you the truth. Okay. So, strong sense of priorities. In a big company, there's a little bit of tendency to sort of scatter around all the R&D dollars to all the different product lines. And you really need a stronger sense of market strategy and priority to do that. So this is BioFires, I call this my top 10 list. This iteration actually has 12, but you'll forgive me. Our top 10 list, I present this every quarter to the company. And I'm not going to go through it on any detail, except to say there's probably 200 projects going on in BioFire right now. But every quarter I talk about the 10 most important projects so that everybody realizes that if there's a slowdown in a top 10 project, that they need to shift resources from a different project to make sure that that project stays up to date, right? How do you trade off resources when something doesn't go according to plan? And these really clear priority lists help with that. And this was not super popular when I first started doing it, because you can imagine how people feel when they find out their project is actually number 32 on the project priority list, right? And so I tried to talk about how there are lots of important projects in the company. It doesn't necessarily matter if you're not on the top 10 list. But if you are on the top 10 list, there's a very high priority to making sure you stay on track and you keep working, okay? So this has, I think, been super helpful in the company, and I strongly encourage these kind of clear priorities. So there's a tendency to fudge on being clear on your priorities because you want to make sure that everybody feels like their job is important. And everyone's job is important, but the company still has higher priorities. And if you make that clear to people, they will make better decisions. Okay. So tolerance for smart mistakes. This is another slide I won't go through, but this is my history of BioFire diagnostics. We have developed, and in that history, we have developed a lot of different things, and most of them were failures. Okay? I can point to exactly 3 successes in our 20 years. Okay? Now, some of my company mates might argue about this a little bit, but we basically had 3 hits: the light cycler, licensing some important chemistries for doing real-time PCR, and the film array, which is the product that I just talked about. And there are dead projects and failures all over this. But the interesting thing is many of these failed projects feed into the film array in a way that made it possible. So this die, which Carl actually was quite involved in developing, was on its own a commercial failure. I think we sold maybe $1,000 worth of it or something. Okay. But that die makes the film array chemistry possible. Right? And none of this was really predictable ahead of time, except that I would say these are a bunch of smart mistakes that all work together to produce a failure. And out of those failures came this success in the end. And that's why you should tolerate smart failures, right? Smart mistakes. How am I doing on time? Oh, I'm good. Yeah?
Q&A at the end if you have.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, and then finally, commitment to obsolete your own products. To an extent that shocked me, big companies are worried about obsoleting or cannibalizing their own products. And we all know some of the classic stories of this, of Kodak having the first digital camera, but not wanting to cannibalize their film sales. And there are a surprising number of examples of those sorts of things. And I think in the end, they're always short-sighted. If you don't obsolete yourself, your competitors will. So this is the next version of the film array, and it's going to give an answer in 15 minutes instead of an hour. And it's going to be even simpler, and we're going to be selling it into physician offices. So right now, you have to go to a hospital to get this kind of testing. And this will open the door for physician offices to have this sort of testing. So you can come in, immediately find out what virus or bacteria you have and get treated without ever going to the hospital. This will cannibalize the film array without any question. Okay? But this is a better product. It will lead to better healthcare. And in the end, I think that you just can't compromise on stuff like that. So manage R&D teams with a light touch. I used the Unbearable Lightness of Innovation from Milan Kundero's novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, where he looks at couples where one member of the couple is sort of light and carefree, and the other is sort of a super serious person. And being an innovative company and a mature company is kind of like that. You're dealing with those same dynamics, and what Kundera shows is that it can either work great or it can be a disaster, depending on how the couples deal with their differences in personality. So it's a fun book. I strongly recommend it. So have a lightness with your R&D teams. They really want to do the right thing. Their schedules are usually pretty good. You don't want to badger them, and you want to make sure they have flexibility when things don't go exactly as they're planned. Okay? Keep focused on your end priority, but not the path to get there. Okay? Demand people speak their mind up and down the organization. And I mean demand, ask for it. Okay? Because if you do not ask for it, it will not happen. Okay? And the other side of that is, of course, when they bring you bad news, you got to listen to it, right? You got to take it seriously. You don't necessarily have to believe everything you hear, but it's good for you to hear it. Tolerate smart mistakes, and obsolete your own products or your competitors will. Okay, that's it. Any questions? So Tom asked what our revenue mix looks like. We are in a razor blade business. So the instruments that we sell are the razors, and the tests that go through them are razor blades. We would give the instruments away if we could figure out who to give them to, honestly. The price of the instrument is like a way to make sure the hospital is serious. Okay? So we really would give them for free if we could. But what we end up doing is we charge thousands to maybe $10,000 for an instrument. And then the individual tests are about $100 a piece. And that's where the money is. So I'd say our revenue is 90% consumable, test consumables, and 10% other.
When these goes into the doctor's office, will that model stay the same?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you don't expect the same volumes of testing in a doctor's office. So we've done a couple of things. We've made the instrument cheaper, so you don't have to amortize as many tests over the life of the instrument to make it make sense. But the math actually still works out. So at a relatively low volume, we can still make the economics of that work out. So, but it's a very insightful question on what sort of the key to it working out in that business is will the doctor's offices run enough tests? And with that in mind, we'll start with bigger like practices that have 10 or 20 different physicians and work from there. Yeah, it's a great question. It's the Walmart question. I would love to have them in Walmarts. Yeah. Yeah, and I was really happy to see at the Dan's just down the street from where I live, they were advertising strep throat tests where they would do the strep throat test and then get you an antibiotic if that's what you required. And it strikes me that for a lot of things, that's the perfect model. I'm totally with you, that whole hassle of going through the doctor's office process. When you just want to, just tell me what I've got and give me the right drug, right? I think that would be the perfect venue for that. And any of you who know the Theranos story knows that was the story they sort of built that empire on, was that they would be able to do that. Sadly, their machine didn't work, but this one will work. Yes, ma'am. We were working on a system trying to do what Theranos' system was trying to do at the same time that Theranos was trying to do it. So it was really interesting to try to see kind of dimly through what was going on there. We worried that it worked and suspected that it didn't, but yeah, they looked like a serious competitor for a while. I think that it is a totally solvable problem and that these instruments start to come very close to that. So all of that becomes possible, and I think that's one of the things that she saw, that was a really compelling story, that you would be able to just go into a CVS and get everything taken care of. And if you read like Bad Blood, you can see that they started out trying to do something good and trying to do the right thing and got slowly seduced to faking it as they became more famous and it became more important that they not fail. So yeah, a really interesting story. So applying for management positions in the company. Yeah, that's a good question. So as a technical company, we always appreciate a little bit of technical background. It's not absolutely required, but it's certainly a big help. So a manager that knows a little bit of biology or a little bit of engineering is super valuable to us. The other things we look for are, some are really simple, like job hunting 101 stuff. Someone who has taken the time to figure out what the company is, what they do, who feels like that's the sort of mission they'd like to be a part of and communicates that is super important. So we'll take someone with enthusiasm every day over someone with a good resume. So we had, it's a great question, competition. So we had 5 years with no competition in this space. It was glorious, I got to tell you. Being a monopolist is a wonderful thing. So, but those days are over. So about 5 years of watching us double every year attracted a better class of shark into our pool. And we've been dealing with multiple companies that are now trying to do the sort of things that we're doing. And part of that obsolete yourself is with an eye to that. Right? If you have a lead and you sit on that lead, they will catch you. If you extend your lead, they will always be behind. So as they struggle to match, say, the depth of our test menu, so we have 5 tests, they'll have 1 test, right? By the time they get to 5 tests, we'll have 20 tests, right? We'll have faster tests. So I think it's really crucial in these fields to just, lengthen that lead, don't just sit on it. And even though it's tempting in the short run, because you can make a lot more money in the short run if you just sit on your lead, it's counterproductive in the end. So it's also less fun. The importance of a life-saving mission versus the importance of, say, upping your CBIT, right? Yeah. And it's always been a big source of emphasis for us that we're in this to make patients' lives better. And I think that's important to me, and it's important to all of our employees. So one of my favorite stories about this is I was standing in line at like a Starbucks or something, and I had some BioFire swag on. And this woman says, "Oh, my son, he works for you guys." I said, "Oh, that's great. Yeah, he's in manufacturing." So the manufacturing of these pouches is very manual. It's like it's assembly line. It's Model A assembly line stuff, right? Where you've got lines of people handing and doing one step at a time. It's tough work, right? So he was down in the manufacturing group and he goes, "Oh yeah, he loves it. He says he feels like he's almost a doctor, diagnosing people from life-threatening illnesses and saving their lives." I was like, yeah, that's perfect, right? So, in one sense, he takes 2 pieces of plastic film and heat seals them and hands them to the next guy. But he realizes that that's part of a life-saving test that can really make a difference in somebody's life. And he feels that. And you want people to feel that because, in the end, it's just so much more important than making a little bit more money, right? So when new employees come in, we spend about a day with them. We show them how to use the instrument. So they actually run tests on each other. Respiratory tests, no lumbar punctures. Yeah. And then I have a collection of stories that physicians and patients send me of patients who have been saved, whose lives have been altered by the results of these tests. And I share those stories regularly throughout the company and just let people know that we're really making a big difference in the way people's lives are being lived. And that ultimately, that's so much more important than anything else that's going on. And people respond to that. I think it's super important to make a difference. And you've got to talk about it all the time. So what is it you talk about? And if all of your all-hands meetings or company meetings are talking about, what the gross margin of manufacturing was this month, then people think that that's what you care about. And if your meetings are spent talking about, a baby whose life was saved by detecting their bacterial meningitis, they think that's what's important to you. So what you spend your time on matters. Yeah, I don't know. So Bob's asking how we're using analytics of all that epidemiological data I showed you on the different viruses going around. And the answer right now is sadly, I don't know. So our first idea was if we could hook a lot of machines together all over the world, we could say something really interesting about the sorts of infections that are coming and going and how they spread. And really, we're at stage 0 or 0.5 of that process. We're just starting to get all the machines hooked together, and we've got analytical data for the first time that says what's out there. And now that we have that data, we're starting to look at what it's useful for. So we're looking for, can we predict the severity of flu seasons? Can we detect outbreaks in hospitals? So some of the diseases we test for are hospital-acquired infections, where it's a bug that's floating around the hospital. And we've got what we call an outbreak detector. So we look into our customers' hospitals, and if there's a little spike of one of these hospital-acquired infection outbreaks, we call the hospital up and warn them that this is coming. And they've been very appreciative. And talk about, customer service that they appreciate. Calling and letting them know that norovirus is about to take off in their hospital makes them really happy with you. Yeah. So. But I think there's a world of really cool stuff to be done there, and we're just scratching the surface of it. This database will probably be the best database of infectious disease information on Earth. Even better than governments have. And what we'll do with that should be really fun. No, not at all. So a question about my background and whether it's scientific or business or both. My formal educational background is all scientific. And my business sense has all been on-the-job training. I am often jealous of guys like you who have been able to get more formal business training rather than trying to figure out as you go by trial and error. I think it's a huge advantage. I doubt I would have been tolerated through this trial and error process in a big company. But in a small company where you're sort of growing the processes as the company grows, you get the chance to sort of make those mistakes, those trial and errors early. So that's one of the things I feel really fortunate about, is to have been able to learn business, which I think is fascinating, and it's fascinating in science in its own way. But learning it sort of on the job.